Welcome to Holyrude Ungagged, the Muhammad Ali of political podcasts. I'll be your host today, David McClement, recording and transmitting from the Blantyre Free State. And it's been another action-packed and, full week in Scottish politics. Started off, they announced that they'd be changing the boundaries of the Westminster constituencies, which at first glance, surprise, surprise, seems to benefit the Tories more than anything else, but we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. The Scottish national football team announced that they would not be taking the knee before their matches at the European Championships. They reversed their position to a certain extent after there was a negative reaction on social media from most Scotland fans. We also had an employment tribunal ruled that gender-critical views in law can constitute a philosophical belief. And we had a Scots Tory MP, Andrew Bowie, backed a controversial report by a noted colonial apologist, Professor Nigel Biggar. So we'll take a look at that in a bit more detail. Surprise, surprise, yet more Tory corruption. We'll talk about that. And the week sort of ended with the reformed Radical Independence Campaign having their first conference in quite some time. If you have anything that you want us to talk about, you can tweet us at _ungagged with the hashtag HolyrudeUngagged, or you can email us at ungaggedleft@gmail.com, and just remember to put Holyrude Ungagged in the subject line. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce my regular colleagues. We have the old reliable of the Holyrude podcast. She's still continuing her 100% record of appearances. She's the digital Michelangelo of Mulgai. It's Miss Deborah Torrance. And also joining us is the prodigal son of the Holyrude podcast, Falkirk's Pizza Hut prince, Mr. Brian Stewart Finlay. And with those guys introduced, let's get ungagged.
And it was nice to hear you smile. Dream a dream 'cause you'll never die. The stars will never overtake the sky. Life has its turns and it takes a while. And it was nice to hear you smile. Nice to hear you smile.
Hi everybody, how are you doing today?
We're doing good. Yes, sir. I can boogie.
First game for Scotland today.
For our viewers, we are recording on the morning before the Scotland game, so
Yeah.
but by this time tomorrow, we might all be even happier or absolutely depressed.
To be honest, it's just nice to be included. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
I think with England, obviously, because they won the first game. And they're like, yeah, it's coming home. We're going to win. And we're just like, it's just nice to be here. Like, just soaking it up and enjoying being included. So
I have actually convinced myself that Scotland's going to win the whole thing.
Yeah.
Politically lost in my own delusion.
Well, as a rugby fan, I don't really have an opinion on the Scottish football team, so I believe you. I think
And
we could win it.
as a rugby fan, you don't deserve them.
yeah. And I know nothing about sport generally, so I'm just glad that people are happy.
In that case, as a football expert here, I'm just explaining that Scotland are at the moment favourites to win the tournament.
Yes.
I would like that to be the case, and it'll be interesting to see how the first game goes. I take it you'll be watching, David.
I will be.
I'll also be watching. I have it scheduled. I've been watching all the games so far. It's been emotional, actually, before Scotland's even in it. What happened to Ericsson, that was
I was
traumatic.
watching that as well. It was horrible to see.
I wasn't watching. I just seen it sort of flag up on social media, and particularly them continuing to film whilst he's receiving really serious medical attention is completely unacceptable. And I know that the BBC have now apologised for that specifically, but what a horrific thing to happen, you know, for his wife being there. He's got 2 young children, and it's just absolutely horrific. But positive outcome so far. He seems to be doing well. So
For
get
his
well soon.
For his teammates and you know, the other players on the pitch, everybody involved, it just must have been so traumatizing. I know watching it was traumatizing, and yeah, best wishes to Ericsson, but also come on Scotland, let's stay at, woo!
Well,
I'm not watching because my mummy's coming up for a wee visit today, so I will be following anything on social media.
I don't want to compare. When you say traumatizing, I've had a bit of a traumatizing morning myself.
Oh no.
Oh, went to change the baby, the wee man.
Oh.
And it's fresh nappy that he just got on. He'd managed to do a poo that big. He'd completely burst right through it. So I get the stress. But I mean, it's my 4th child. I'm used to this. I could deal with that level of emergency.
Mm-hmm.
Then compounded halfway through it, he pees almost right in my face, which for people that don't know, this is my first son after 3 daughters. I wasn't quite prepared for the extra range that baby boys have when they pee. So I haven't developed that reflex yet. And just to finish the trifecta, as soon as I just was finished, he vomited all over us. So the trifecta of pee, poo, and puke.
That's some morning.
It is. And it's only 20 to 10.
I was just going to say, your skin looks really nice. Like you've just had a lovely facial.
So I hope you said nicer mornings than I did.
Yeah, on reflection, mine has been relatively peaceful. And
well, I had a stressful morning trying to get here in time, and I was even early.
You were here. You were the first one here. So because you were the one thinking, oh, I might be a little bit late, but no. I logged on and expected David to be here, but no.
No, he was.
You were.
He was.
You were the one that was late.
Yeah.
I was too busy covered in bodily fluids.
Bodily fluids.
It was a pleasant surprise when I logged in to see he's already here waiting for me. It was nice.
It's always nice, isn't it?
Okay, well, we crack on then because it's been another busy week with quite a lot to talk about. I'm realising that I'm going through the exact same roller coaster every week, where a few days into the week, I panic that we'll not have anything to talk about. And by the time the podcast comes round, I'm thinking, oh, what are we going to have to leave out because we can't possibly talk about all these things. But we'll try and cram everything in. We'll see how we go. So first up, seems like a long time ago now, but at the start of the week, they announced they're going to have new boundaries for a lot of the constituencies and across the UK for the Westminster elections. Winners or losers in that. Again, it seems to be that the Tories will be the winners, which seems to be every time they change the boundaries, it seems to benefit the Tories. But also, it seems to disproportionately benefit the South East of England, who will gain 10 seats at the expense of Scotland, who will lose 2, and Wales, that will lose 8 seats, which is like 20% of their all their representatives. Yeah, so what were you thinking when you were looking at this?
Yeah, I think it was, my first reaction was, it's very blatant, isn't it? I mean, 8 from Wales, 2 from Scotland, 10 to England. I know that there's been some argument on social media from certain quarters saying that Scotland and indeed Wales was overrepresented by population in Westminster, which might be true. But at the same time, it's not really the best sort of message to be sending out, particularly at the moment. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, representative of the Union. So we're just taking seats away from the two nations which have growing support for an independence movement and putting them into England. As we see, as you stated, it seems to be the Tories that are going to benefit from this, which is a recurring theme. It just, the problems with Westminster system goes way, way beyond who's got how many seats. I think we've spoken about them in some of the other pods, about the voting system, how the Westminster system is very Westminster centric, which sounds a bit strange, but if you've got a part of the United Kingdom which has so much more seats represented than the 3 other nations, then there's no way for these nations to veto really, really important discussions. We've seen that with Brexit. We've seen it with loads of other votes. Trident, for example, as well. And it really just, this is just another layer on top of basically how badly representative Westminster politics is
Yeah.
for Scotland and for the other nations and even England to some extent, how badly centralised it is.
Well, I just think if you need more representation to, reflect the population increases in your area, then just add seats rather than trying to rejig them. Do you know what I mean? Because as you said, Wales has only got a small amount of representatives anyway, and taking 8 away from them, did you say that's like a fifth of their representation?
Yeah, I think they've got 40 at the moment, so
40,
after these changes they'll only have 32.
Yeah, and 2 away from Scotland. I mean, we've already got, the West Lothian question, the massive democratic deficit, which is what the whole, constitutional arguments are about. So I just think that it's a bit silly, and it comes back down to what is the function of Westminster, and they've got 650 MPs squashed in this building that isn't, going to hold them anyway. So maybe that's the root of all the problems. Maybe.
Well, they made a big deal how they decided not to reduce the number of MPs, which was the original plan. I think at one stage David Cameron wanted to bring it down to 600.
Right.
And it's like, in some ways that's an easy sell to the public because less politicians, everybody seems happy with that, but really it's less representatives for us, for the people. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the argument is about the number of MPs you can fit into the building, which is kind of a ludicrous thing to argue when you're basically saying we have to decrease our democracy in order to fit people into this crumbling building that just isn't really fit for purpose.
It's not just Scotland and Wales that are losing out, though. The North East, they're going to lose 2 representatives. West Midlands are going to lose 2. North West is going to lose 2. And they're all going to, the South East, South West, Eastern and London, which is where, the economic and social drain is anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, and it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like you say, well, that's where the population's moving to, so we need to put more of the political power there. And it's like, well, then you'll just encourage more of a population drain from the north if this area is getting economically and politically abandoned.
And really, if even from the Tories' perspective, as we know, they tend not to make very good decisions about representation of the areas that seem to be supporting them at the time. We're talking about, the north of England, the red wall seats that vote Tory and all that kind of stuff. And you think, is this going to impact on that? I mean, I'm not sure. But, if you want to retain support in these areas which are now voting Tory, cutting seats doesn't sound like the best way to do that. But then, of course, like you said, David, it could be viewed as, I don't know, like some kind of cost-cutting exercise or whatever, but they're not losing any MPs in total. They're just moving them from the north and giving them to the southeast and southwest. It just seems, counterintuitive.
Part of the argument that you kind of mentioned earlier is they want to try and equalise as much as possible how many people are in each constituency to make it fairer, as they would say.
But change the voting system.
Well, that's it. I mean, if you really want to make it fairer, first past the post is probably the first thing you would look to get rid of. But it's not the number of people in a constituency isn't the only thing you should take into account. You have to take into account some kind of view of historical boundaries and geography. Like there was loads of people, even sort of mere people on the right, pulling their hair out, like at some of the ludicrous sort of shapes of the constituencies and just cutting across sort of like historical towns. I mean, they changed the boundaries in Scotland, I don't know, probably about 10, 15 years ago when they reduced the MPs from 72 to 59. And one of the things they did is Hamilton, which is the 8th, I think like the 8th biggest town, or like towns and cities, it's like the 8th most populous in Scotland, is now like cut right down the middle between half of it's thrown in with Rutherglen and the other half is thrown in with Lanark. There's no sort of attention paid to kind of historic patterns of where populations are or anything like that?
It's almost like cutting the boundaries to make up the numbers. Do you know what I mean? So they think, on average, we want to have this amount of people living in each constituency. So poor Hamilton gets cut down the middle, and you end up with no full representation because towns like Hamilton specifically. I mean, if you look at Hamilton, if you just walk down Hamilton High Street in their town centre and stuff, they really need some proper representation. Hi.
Sorry, we've just get a wee unwelcome guest. Well,
Hello.
not unwelcome, but
Hello.
You saying hello, Melody?
Hi, Melody. She's welcome.
She's not talking, so if she stays quiet, she can stay.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were talking about Hamilton there, Ryan.
Just saying that they really, could really be doing with some consistent representation. Just having one person to stand up for their town in Westminster rather than just conveniently having their town split in half to fit to play the numbers right. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, because I mean, how does that affect how an MP represents an area? You're either going to have maybe, like for example, I live in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. If you're either going to have an MP who maybe will prioritise Rutherglen because that's what they're familiar with, and Hamilton West only actually makes up a kind of smaller proportion of their seat, or you'll have somebody who's maybe from Hamilton that will prioritise that even though it's only a small part. It's just not good for representation.
I just wonder, is this a form of gerrymandering, moving the rejigging the constituencies?
Certainly seems that way, doesn't it? I mean, it's quite a hefty word to throw around sometimes, but if it looks like gerrymandering, sounds like gerrymandering, and the impacts are like gerrymandering, maybe it's gerrymandering, because you're taking away support from Wales, Scotland, and the north of England and putting it down into the southeast and southwest of England. But obviously their argument for doing that is to make sure that it's much more representative. So like David said, if you wanted to be more representative, then change your voting system or increase the numbers of MPs and actually have a building that's fit for purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Boundary Commission is supposed to be independent, but I don't know in reality who sits on it, who decides who sits on it. So who knows how these things work. I know certainly in America, the congressional district, gerrymandering is just seen as part of the political game. I mean, you can go online and look at the shape of some of the constituencies, and they're like, some of them are like octopuses. It's like the only rule is that they have to connect. So sometimes literally you'll have a constituency with two big population centres with like a thin sort of 30-metre strip of land connecting them. And it's just to connect to sort of areas that will be beneficial to whatever party's drawing it. And both sides have been guilty of it. It's just seen as if you win power in that area, that's part of the perks, is you get to try and redraw the boundaries to suit your party. And it's
right, that's just nuts, isn't it?
And the loser is the voter, the electorate.
Yeah, and also as well, I think we've seen, during the COVID situation with the sort of virtual parliaments, how parliaments can become a lot more inclusive. I know that Gail Ross was one, obviously, that was way up in Ross-shire, who stood down because she wanted to spend more time with her family and be on hand a bit more. And now, all of a sudden, it's become normalised for MPs to be in their constituencies, joining via virtual parliament, even able to vote that way. So I think we might have solved that problem, but like so many workplaces where you're forced to do something and realise it does actually work, and in some places it's better. So, for people like Gail Ross, this time round, Parliament might have been a completely different experience. And you would think, for constituents, that you would want your MP to be on hand a lot more, particularly in an area which is so far away from the Parliament, that only to reduce transportation and climate emissions, but for people to be on hand, to be in their constituency, yet still participating in parliamentary process. It just seems, if the Parliament doesn't fit enough MPs in it, which we know Westminster doesn't, then you've just solved your own problem.
Yeah. And it's much more accessible as well. So
absolutely.
There's the other sort of point that I meant to pick up, that part of when you decide that you're going to be really rigid in how many constituents are allowed to be in each constituency, that then varies massively how geographically big some constituencies will be. Some inner city London constituencies will be tiny, like large neighbourhoods, but then you've got some Highland constituencies that, after previous sort of boundary changes, are like ludicrously big geographically. I think there's one that's like the size of Belgium. And
wow.
So you turn around and say, "Oh, it's to be fairer for all represented to have the same number of constituents," but how can Jeremy Corbyn, I think, in the smallest constituency, I'm sure he can represent his constituents better in that small area and see more people than somebody, an MP in the Highlands, who has got a 3-hour drive to try and find a constituency or go to different surgeries. It's other factors that are just dismissed in this obsession with we need to make sure all the numbers are the same.
Yeah, and how good can somebody represent local issues if they live 3 hours away? I mean, it just doesn't seem to make sense, because we know that there's so many like sort of localized issues in different towns, villages, and things like that people want to raise in Parliament. And if you are representing a constituency the size of Belgium, how on earth do you, first of all, know all that information, but also actually be part of it and part of the solution? It just doesn't seem to make sense. So, shimmying the MPs around to match the numbers doesn't improve local representation, and having this horrendous first past the post system doesn't give us a good parliament, and the Westminster system doesn't support a good functioning democratic union. So I don't think things are really going in the direction that we want them to.
No.
There is one sort of positive thing, if you're that way inclined, that a lot of people have sort of ran sort of notional results to see how the new boundaries would change the current sort of results of a general election, and they now think that the Green Party of England and Wales will be competitive in Bristol Central and Sheffield Central, which again is a bit of an indictment of the Westminster system. It's not that the Green Party is any more popular than they were at the last election, but under these new boundaries, they might triple their representation.
Wow. Triple.
Well, 1 to 3.
Yeah.
But that's, this really speaks to the first past the post argument again, is that, I think the Greens now, the last Westminster polling seems to be pretty consistent for the Green Party, and you're looking at 9% overall for Westminster voting intentions, and the Lib Dems are down about 6 or 7%. Yeah, the Lib Dems still get to keep the 9 seats they've got, and the Green Party only have 1. If we look at the current constituency makeup. So I think if we're going to sort anything, it really, really needs to be the voting system rather than just shimmying boundaries around for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, this doesn't seem to be like a solution to anything, really. They're trying to fix a problem that isn't necessarily there, when the problems that need fixed, they're not even trying to address, really, are they? A parliament is too small for their workforce, and as you say, constituencies that are massive, sometimes island, separate islands, got to get a plane for Barra. What I mean? That type of thing. It's aye.
I should say that there has been some sort of dispensations for some islands that they are allowed to have less than the specified number of constituents, which shows they can recognise it. These factors in some situations. So I don't know why that goes out the window when they come to the mainland.
Because it's inconvenient.
Next sort of thing, there was a bit of controversy. The Scotland team announced that they wouldn't be taking the knee before their games at the European Championships. There was a bit of a backlash to this. I think it was compounded by the fact that the England players had been booed by sections of their own fans when they took the knee against racial discrimination. The Ireland players were booed when they did the same in Hungary. So to a lot of people, including myself, it looked like the Scotland team were basically scared of getting booed, so they were going to sort of kowtow to that racism by taking a stand against racism, they said, which I don't know how taking a stand against racism is different from just standing before the game. What were you thinking? Obviously, you aren't as into football as me, but I saw that you were tweeting about it as well.
When it happened with the Scotland rugby team, and it kind of annoyed me a wee bit. It was like, why are they not all kneeling? But they left it up to the players. You know, it was the players' individual decisions and they came out after the fact. The rugby union and spoke about it, but this SPL announcing it before the game, oh, we're going to take a stand. And I understand that it's something to do with a Rangers player, Kamara, and how he had been racially abused at a game. They were playing in, was it Europa? Forgive me if I'm getting these things wrong. My girlfriend will slag me.
They were playing in a Europa League match, and Glenn Kamara was racially abused, and the other player was banned for 10 games. And then the aftermath, some of the Rangers players said they didn't want to take the knee because, I don't know, they felt as if it was a gimmick, and that people were taking the knee and not actually, you know, solving the issue. I mean, I don't know if I quite agree with that. I mean, I don't know. Were people expecting that if football players sitting kneeling, that racism would be clear and gone within a few months or 6 months? So I'm not really sure I agree with that line of thinking, but that sort of spread, and that was sort of stand the national team took. But it just looked really bad that the timing of releasing that right after other teams had come under fire for it, and it looked as if it was caving into this ridiculous argument that somehow kneeling against racial discrimination was some kind of Marxist conspiracy, which you see flying about, that in fact Black Lives Matters invented racism and everything was wonderful before that. And yeah, it was just horrible to see, and it was horrible to see that Scotland, 21 years since we've been to 23 years since we've been to a major tournament, and I certainly felt as if it would be horrible if the first time Scotland was seen in that sort of stage again after a generation. A lot of people thought, oh, are Scotland sort of a racist country? Did they not support that kind of campaign? Because a lot of people wouldn't know the details of what happened to Glenn Kamara and the reasoning that the players were possibly not taking the knee. So it would have sent a horrible message.
I just thought that it's a show of solidarity, and I don't see how it's such a big deal, to be honest. I just, in my brain, I can't fathom why you say, no, I'm not doing that.
Why is it even? I mean, a lot of these people that refuse to take the knee, they're saying, I mean, I'm not at all racist. And it's like, well, you know, I have to kind of question that if even this small gesture is too much for you. And
exactly.
Has to be overcomplicated with accusations of Marxist conspiracies.
Yeah, I very much agree with what both of you have been saying. I think at the moment we know that taking the knee before sports games it's a really symbolic thing, and it does show standing up to racism. Obviously, the sort of basis of this, to my understanding, is the Colin Kaepernick thing in America, where he stood down, he kneeled during the national anthem, and I think he received a lot of backlash when he done that. From the political establishment at the time under Trump and various other, and even the authorities as well, American football. And I think that it has become something that people are aware of. They know that if you take the knee before a sports game, it's to stand in solidarity with people who face racism, and that includes their colleagues, people, their fans, all these types of things. And I think that doing that at the moment, particularly in the face of being booed by certain factions of fans, I think is a really, really powerful statement. And I think that if Scotland had made the decision to take the knee before every game, rather than just before the England game, which is, to my understanding, is what is happening now, that I think that would be such a powerful message, and much more powerful than do we take the knee or do we not? It's the fact, no, we decide to take the knee because we want to highlight racism, but we want to do it in the face of certain factions of their fans wanting to boo people and stand up to those people. It's a similar thing to when football players choose to stand up against any form of prejudice. So if we talk about when we used the rainbow laces, I think it was a couple of years ago, there was people saying, oh, they shouldn't be doing that. You need to take politics out of football. well, actually, you deciding to take that out of football is also political. So you just want your political views to be heard during football. And sport is really, really political. We can't take that away, particularly when it comes to international football. And we should be standing, as we should do in our daily lives, solidarity with people who are oppressed and people who face bigotry and prejudice. And I think that this is a real opportunity for us as a nation, because this is a huge platform, first time in 23 years, to say, we do not accept this. We do not accept this view, and we will stand up to those fans and viewers across the world, that we will stand in solidarity with these people and in the face of your apparent rejection of us choosing to do that.
Yeah, so there was an employment tribunal ruling this week that ruled that gender critical views in law could constitute a philosophical belief. This was rejoiced over the Twitter and social media by certain sections that are quite hostile to trans people. Brian, this is kind of your area in terms of employment law and things like that. So
yeah, I mean, I thought the reaction to this outcome was pretty fascinating. Obviously not great for trans people and their allies across the UK. It essentially is just throwing fuel on the fire for the sort of gender critical individuals who have seen this as some sort of huge victory. If we actually read the judgment, it's not much to really take away. I mean, this particular case is pretty complex, but it's about Maya Forstater, who was working on a sort of contractual basis for an organisation and who did not have her contract renewed because she was making it very clear on sort of their intranet system and on Twitter that she held these gender critical views, and essentially said that trans women were not women, and people who believed that or said that was, I can't remember the exact word that was used in the article, but it was literal delusion. This what was said. She took it to the employment tribunal, and the judge there said that, because of those views could not be protected because it was not a philosophical belief, which in my view is wrong, because you can hold a philosophical belief about anything. And even the judge in this particular case has said anything's a philosophical belief that's short of Nazism or totalitarianism and can be protected under law. But what the most important thing about this ruling, and this is where is a bit of an own goal falling on, that's another football joke. Yay, is that basically in this ruling, they've said you can hold these beliefs, but it's the actual expression of those beliefs. And if you are basically abusing or being discriminatory towards a trans person, so if you say that, if you choose not to use their chosen pronouns, for example, that you are in fact being discriminatory, and that is actually what, under employment law specifically, and that's their interpretation of the equalities law, that's what's particularly problematic, and that trans person should be protected from. So, Maya, when she basically, what this ruling actually allows is for the tribunal to take place again under the context of the gender critical is actually a philosophical belief, but those actions that she had made will not change because it's actually been said within the ruling that we've just had. That I really don't think it'll have a massive impact or change the outcome of the original tribunal. So it's kind of been taking a small thing as a win and sort of running with it to drum up support on social media. But I believe, and my understanding and my hope is that this will make absolutely no difference to the ruling. And because particularly Maya was a contractor, so actually to renew somebody's contracts, there's not much protections against people for reasons why organizations have to renew contracts. So it's a bit of a strange one because it's not an employment situation. It's more of a sort of contractual, rolling contract. So there's it's a very interesting case, which I've been following really, really closely from the start. But I don't think that this will make a massive difference to the outcome. But just a caveat, I am not an employment law specialist. I do, my academic interest is very much in HR, but from my understanding, I really can't see this having much of an impact on the overall outcome of the tribunal.
Well, you're more an expert than me, that's for sure.
It's interesting what the judge said about anything, bar Nazism and utilitarianism is
Mhm.
a philosophical belief. So, like, if you are a flat Earth fan, is that a philosophical belief? If you are an anti-vaxxer, is that a philosophical belief? Like,
Yeah.
that opens up a lot of, I can say, some really obnoxious things now. So
Also, ethical veganism was one of the examples that was used. So that's, on the other scale of things, I mean, that really has no major impact on
yeah,
somebody. But even if you're a flat earther or an anti-vaxxer, you can hold those views. And I think it's important that, to some extent, that people have got the freedom to believe what they want to believe. Of course, there's caveats and concerns with that, but it's the actual expression of these philosophical beliefs. As long as you're not abusing or showing hate or discriminating against individuals, then that's fine. If you really, really believe in these gender critical views, philosophical belief, that's full stop after that. I have no views beyond that. But if you choose to misgender somebody or not use the wrong pronouns, not only is it just completely disrespectful, but you're actually causing that person harm, you're showing prejudice, and that's the crime.
Yeah, one of the things that I wonder about this is, are we going to lead to a lot of gender critical folk ending up in meetings with HR? Because it seems, glancing at Twitter, that a lot of them now think they have carte blanche to say and do what they want in the workplace, and they're going to find out that that's not quite the case quite quickly. Because, yeah, like you said, you can hold these beliefs, but you're not allowed to impose them on people or use them to discriminate against people. So is it really the philosophical belief thing? Is it really like you're allowed to hold almost any belief, but not necessarily express it? Which seems a bit of a sort of strange line to draw for me.
Yeah, I was trying to think how I could create criminality if I started believing in ethical veganism. Like, could you could you go and release hunters of sheep via slaughter truck, or and then
Well, I suppose you could stand in the staff canteen and shout abuse at anybody that's ordering the cheeseburgers.
It's a really interesting line to draw, but the thing is, if somebody holds these beliefs and they never ever make it public, so ultimately they're not doing anything wrong, and I'm saying that in inverted commas, in the workplace, because bear in mind the remit of this case is employment law.
Yeah.
And it's using the equalities law to interpret employment situation. So you could actually recruit somebody. You have no idea their views on politics and people and race and all these types of things, but until they express something, that's when it becomes problematic, because ultimately you're if you want to look at it from that perspective, employers are buying labor power from somebody. They're coming and doing the job and going home. So it's what happens during that employment relationship that is essentially under scrutiny and that will be relevant to the employment tribunal.
So does this mean, like, if you tweet something out of work hours, you can't be held accountable for that? Or
Oh, that's a whole other.
It's another can of worms.
It depends. This depends on. It depends on the context, and it also depends on the policies and procedures in place in the organisation. Because if you on your Twitter says, "I work in such and such, and I'm the manager of such and such," and you're tweeting these things, well, you can say, "Oh, these are personal views," but then does that then bring the company into disrepute? And do you also not follow a reasonable management request because they ask you not to put abuse on social media? So it might not actually be the actual you tweeting something racist or whatever. It's these two other things that you would actually face disciplinary action for, which is quite interesting.
When I hear philosophical beliefs, I always think of the case of the baker who wouldn't bake a gay wedding cake.
Mm-hmm.
Like that always springs up, and ultimately they were found to be discriminatory, even though they had these philosophical beliefs, didn't they?
Yes.
I can't remember the exact case, but I just remember.
There's quite a few of those kind of cases in different countries around the world, and of course every law is different. Even from Scotland and England, things can be slightly different in that context. But basically, you can hold the belief that, and this is the thing, anyone can believe that I don't think that I should marry somebody of the same sex or the same gender as me. Then just don't do it.
Exactly.
But you cannot impose those views on somebody else. And this is similar to the employment situation. That's where the problem lies. So if you are somebody who does not believe that you should marry somebody of the same sex and the same gender, then don't do it, but don't not provide a service for somebody because they want to do that. And this is, people talk about, oh, but this is, infringing the whole free speech debate, which again would take up a whole pod, and, we're not going to do that today. But free speech is not free of repercussions. And so you can say whatever you want. You can say, if you really want to be that petty and that hateful and misgender somebody constantly and do it, do it aware, you're aware that you're doing it and you're doing it for that reason. But you have to face the consequences of your choices and your expressions of your philosophical beliefs. And that's free speech for you.
When I've heard them like talking about the gay wedding cake sort of scenario that's cropped up a lot, and because it's a cake, it sort of sounds a bit frivolous. And I think at first glance, a lot of people might say, well, what's it matter? Go to another baker's. Why would you want to give your money to somebody that hates you anyway? But if you look at it, like you said, it's a service. And it says, okay, well, fine, maybe having bakers refusing to serve is one thing. What if a fireman decides his philosophical beliefs mean he's not going to get you at that burning building? And that's you have to follow it to the extreme, that allowing the baker to sort of pick and choose, as the beginning of, well, why no other professions? And then you get into, well, is a doctor allowed to not provide treatment to you because they've got some kind of objection to your lifestyle or your something in your life, and that's why you need equality.
Exactly. And I think for like I said, this is a really, really complex case, and there is a really, really good article, so I'm going to plug it because this is where a lot of my reading came from. Like, the basis of my reading comes from Pink News a lot on this topic, because I think it's a very, very good source, and it's from Vic Parsons, this particular article, that is a really, really good one-stop shop for somebody that wants to kind of understand the case a little bit better. Because when it comes to any court cases, particularly employment, it's always layer upon layer upon layer of context that's needed for this type of thing. So if anyone wants to understand a little bit of that, please have a look at Vic's article on Pink News, and that will sort you out.
Okay, the next item, there was a report that came out entitled "How Progressive Anti-Imperialism Threatens the United Kingdom." Based on that title, I would have thought that was somebody for the left arguing that, but it was actually somebody for the right, and it was backed by a Tory MP who wrote the foreword for it, Andrew Bowie. I wasn't sure whether to talk about this, but The National done a great story where they dove in and found the seven crazy sort of claims in this. So I'll just take you through it and discuss one at a time. The first thing he said was that we have to stop Scottish independence because it will weaken the West. I'm not sure if MD's told Professor Bigger that the Cold War finished quite some time ago.
This is another thing. What is the West? Who is the West? Go West? Nino West? I don't know what the West is. It's the same as the left.
And when they say the West, they don't always mean like South America. The West sometimes a euphemism for white countries. Because they'll say the West and they'll include Australia, who by what definition is Australia West, but Peru isn't, so that was his opening gambit, which kind of gives you a clue, the sort of what we're thinking here.
Where we're going.
He goes on to then claim that Scottish independence support is a secular religion. When I looked into it, I found out that Professor Bigger is also an Anglican priest. So he's obviously coming at this from quite an extreme Christian sort of viewpoint, and he wants to, because it's a secular religion, he wants to rewrite British history to develop a morally attractive story about the UK in order to get young people to identify with it. So this is his plan, to get young people to not support independence by creating a fake narrative about the UK and its apparently positive role in the world and empire and imperialism.
Aye, so they're now doing creative writing. And
then goes on to say that the economic impact of Brexit is an illusion. That'll be good to know. I'm sure the McVitie's factory workers will be very pleased to know that them losing their jobs is an illusion. And I'm sure the farmers and the fishermen that are really worried at the moment with some of the trade deals that are getting done, this will be a huge relief to them.
And all the exporters and importers, it's just an illusion.
I love the next one. He's planning to stop to save the union. Meme propaganda.
Oh, that's my department. Memes.
You have got a real challenger there.
Oh, I'm in it.
The right can't meme though, so I really don't think we've got much to worry about there. If you see, there was a good bad attempt at right memming. Was about Lorna Slater's. We're gonna. It was the Lord Farquaad one that if you lose all your jobs in the oil and gas industry, that's the price I'm willing to pay, which is the exact opposite of what Lorna Slater actually said in Parliament, in the Green Manifesto, and every single public appearance that she has made on the subject of transitioning from oil and gas to renewables. So there's an example of what word is best to describe. NAF. I think NAF is good. NAF
Rubbish.
memes that we're going to get coming from the right, which I think will actually backfire ultimately. So
I think it'll be hilarious. I really hope they do this. It'll be, they're going to be terrible.
And the Scottish left will respond with counter memes. And it'll be a wonderful war of the memes.
War of the memes. Oh, that's lovely.
Professor Bigger is 66 years old, and you can feel it when he's talking about memes. I get the impression he maybe didn't know what a meme was until he was researching for this paper, and now he sort of thinks he's presenting this great thing that nobody knows about, when it's actually something that most teenagers are knocking them out like every second day.
Do you know a fun fact about memes, where they actually come from, right? And this is because it's involved a little bit in my research, because some of my findings are in the forms of memes. The term memes comes from Richard Dawkins in 1979, and it's an artifact of culture.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an artifact of culture passed down like a gene is biologically.
There's an artifact that can be passed on. It's just, which I thought was quite beautiful, when actually people just see memes as, a picture of a dog having a cup of tea with a fire behind it. It's quite nice that.
It's always great. I wonder if the professors pronounce it as Mimi. I've heard people call it that.
Mimi.
Mimi, yeah.
What a funny Mimi.
I liked one of the earliest memes was Killjoy was here. Do you know about this? And it was during the Second World War, and it was a wee drawing of a man over a wall with his nose hanging over the wall like that, with his hands like that, and you could just see his head. And it was graffiti that spread with like the American forces going through Europe, and it was graffitied in places where all the troops would arrive and they'd say, "Oh, Killjoy was here," and it's a wee. And it spread all over Europe.
Yeah.
You go.
Didn't know that.
You go, but
see, this is loads of the amount that the listeners are learning today.
Exactly.
The next one's good as well. Basically, because there's nothing much to it beyond what I'm about to say, where basically independence is a crime.
Is it?
Doesn't explain how it's a crime. He just quotes somebody else who hates independence, who said that independence would be a crime against the free and open nations and all that they stand for.
It's ironic that I believe that the parties that support independence and that might bring around independence actually wants to have a more open immigration system, which I think is a little bit ironic there. So, if it's a crime to, remove us from certain unions, which obviously it will do, I just think it's quite an interesting take.
Well, I mean, I think be free and open nations, somehow I don't think he's talking about immigration policy. Don't know what he's talking about, but I'm pretty sure he's not talking about that.
He's talking about the fact there's going to be a border somewhere, and a border is a bad thing. But if you have a nice open border with a fair immigration system, then that, to me, counteracts that a wee bit. But some people just don't like the idea of having a border, whether it's any kind of border.
I mean, I think linked back to the first point of weakening the West, I think he's really just talking about free to have nuclear weapons and be allowed to bomb whoever they want. That's what I think he's talking about.
Yeah.
Free and open.
Yeah, it's a crime not to have nukes, according to this guy.
Well, that's probably the kind of weakening the West thing, because, we want rid of the nuclear weapons in the Clyde, and the rump UK will not really have a place to put them, apparently. They were talking about putting them somewhere I'm not sure where, somewhere not in England anyway. They weren't talking about relocating them south of the border.
Poor Wales will probably get them or something.
I think there's only a few limited places that can take it because of loads of, I'm no expert by any means, but I know that there's a lot of requirements that it needs. And I think it's Plymouth or the Thames is the only places that would safely hold the nuclear warheads, and I can't really see that going down very well.
You couldn't put them next to a major city. That'd be ridiculous.
No,
well, I know exactly. Imagine being 40 miles away from a city. That would just be such a ridiculous idea.
Oh, it's depressing thinking about how far away it is. Like, it's not
You're
far
closer
from
as
me.
well.
I know. It's like 3 glens away.
See if a nuclear weapon goes up, give a wee phone, Deborah, just to get a wee bit of warning.
Okay. Give you a wee text. Nuke on the way.
Just
it's horrible.
So I don't waste my last 40 seconds on the earth before I get vaporised. Number 6 on the National's sort of list of 7 bonkers things in this report was quite sinister. They want to reduce the subjective element and the definition of harassment within the equalities law. And it's like, why do you want to make it easy to harass people? How sinister is that?
Maybe it's so people can express their philosophical beliefs.
There we go.
Exactly.
So it ties together beautifully.
It's really not very positive, is it?
So is that so people can express their love of Scottish independence in the workplace, you think?
No, that's a crime.
That's a crime. All right, so that's a crime.
Independence is a crime.
Let's allow harassment. Harassment's fine. Want to be independent is a crime. Right, just we're getting it clear. Wouldn't want to claim he's inconsistent. And then number 7 is they would like to review Scottish history. So they want to review British history to make it better, presumably, and review Scottish history to make it worse. That's basically what they're talking about here.
I mean, as if they've not already, reviewed Scottish history by being the victors in many instances anyway. Like, what they're going to further reduce it? Oh, it's a bit frustrating, isn't it?
I think it shows as well that I think the Scottish Tories, they in the last sort of what election was it, 2016, when they massively increased the number of MSPs, sort of doubled them, and have held that. I think what it's shown is they don't really have the depth within the Scottish Tory party. That the quality of their MSP has plummeted. You get like Andrew Bowie was also in the news because he thought he was really clever online by slagging the SNP for not coming to education debates at Westminster.
That's right.
And people were pointing out, well, that's because they're not allowed to anymore. Like they made a decision, a philosophical decision, you might say, that it wouldn't be appropriate for them to take part in devolved matters that only affected England. But I think now with the English votes for English laws, even if they wanted to, they couldn't take part.
Well, they could be included because they could sit there and listen.
Yeah, that's
the version of inclusion.
That's what I want my MPs doing. Just sitting listening to stuff that they can't actually do anything about.
Vote on, yeah. But the whole education thing there is, again, this is a problem, right? If you have concerns about a particular aspect of the education system in Scotland, whether it be the history, then have a debate about it in the correct place. So that would be Holyrude for this particular thing. So the fact a Tory MP is saying that this is what we should do, without really saying, well, actually what we should do is have a debate about this in Holyrude, right? That's the first problem. Second problem is this isn't the real issue here, whether, making the union look great or whatever, because history in itself is all about who wrote it and when, yeah? So exactly. It always comes from a perspective, and the perspective is most likely to be in sort of more ancient history or whatever. I'm not a historian, so I could be getting my timelines completely wrong, but generally that would come from a privileged white male perspective. So you've already got huge biases there. So if you want to address those, I don't know how you'd address those, but great. But I think what we need to do is, rather than saying, oh, well, we don't want Scotland to look good, we want the union to look great, can we just look at the colonialism, particularly in history? Because there was also a piece by, I think it was Kev McKenna in the Herald, who was saying that we don't learn about Scottish history in Scotland. That's rubbish, right? That is unhelpful in this debate, because we do. And I've spoken to people who went to school at different times. During the 1990s, I learned about Scottish history. People who know in the 80s, 70s, we've always learned about Scottish history. So let's just park that for a minute.
Is it not though that it's not really officially part of the syllabus? It's like, because I remember doing stuff about Scottish history in primary 7, but it was like a sort of project.
Yeah.
Which, if I'd been a year older, then I would have missed that. And I don't really think I get much other Scottish history.
Well, no, I didn't take history at high school, but I know that at high school we had it in first and second year, but we learned a lot about Scottish history there, and all the way through primary school. But again, I don't know if it's officially in the syllabus or if it's not. But again, if we want to have that debate, then that should happen in Holyrood, not by some report written by some guy who thinks independence is a crime.
We can definitely agree on that.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting, a wee quote they had about it, saying that they want the purpose of the report and this section you're talking about, reviewing Scottish history, is they want to expose any undue Scottish nationalist bias.
Yeah.
And they want to maintain political neutrality, right? But if you're saying you don't want to tell them about the Siege of Berwick because that might make people think, hey, why did that happen? Maybe independence is a bit better than this union. It defeats whatever they're saying about political neutrality. Like, how's it our fault that the past actions of England, has this effect now on youth of today who are going, wait a minute, I didn't know this happened. Mm-hmm. I just think it's a bit naive of the guy.
I think it's important to approach any education in context, and I think having those open debates, I think particularly when it comes to colonialism, because that is something that is so absent.
Oh, definitely.
And it's like, and I know that the Scottish Government, before the last Parliament finished, that they were going to address that problem, and that was going to be part of the debate. If you really want to chuck in the fantastic findings of this report into that debate and take away this unconscious bias towards pro-independence, then have that discussion within there, and then the 31 MSPs and the Tories can vote for that, and everyone else can vote it down, and then we can move on. But it just seems that, again, similar to the situation we were talking about in Westminster, that this isn't addressing the problem. This is just, there might be a slither of an issue here that you think, oh, maybe there might be a wee bit bias for this and bias for that. History is bias throughout, right? Yeah. We know that. And, if you read the books in Ireland versus some history books in Ireland versus the history books that you get in England or in Scotland, they're quite different. So history is biased. Okay, that's what's going to happen. So we need to accept that, and people should approach history by knowing that there will be biases here. So perhaps we need to be training and educating people to have critical thinking skills whilst approaching things like history, whilst approaching things like sociology, whilst approaching all these types of things, because as a country, we're not taught to be critical as such until you get to a certain level of education. So perhaps saying, I get it, some primary school, it might be a bit early, but as we get a bit more developed, approach things in a more critical way and say, well, this is what was happening at the time. This is who wrote it. This is the perspective that it comes from. And then people might realize that, when it comes to history and sociological issues, that there's different perspectives. And that would be a really good starting point for people engaging with politics too.
When I done standard grade history, it was one of the few subjects that did sort of teach that kind of critical aspect. Like, they were really, one of the first things they taught is always look at the bias in a source. One of the things we looked at was the First World War, and they said, okay, look at where's the bias in this source? This is a source about coming from the British side about the conduct of German soldiers. What bias might they have there, like in terms of propaganda and things like that? And it is something that actually could be applied to a lot more subjects, because there is bias everywhere, and that's fine. You can't really avoid it. When I'm suspicious when people try to claim they're not biased, because that's not really possible. But
yes,
bias is fine as long as you can identify it. It's like, I'm fine watching stuff in the BBC because I know they'll be coming from a particular political perspective. Same with Russia Today, you watch that. If I'm watching a story about South America, it's fine. If it's a story about Ukraine, I know to take sort of some aspects there, because they will have certain inbuilt biases and agendas there. But it isn't something that's applied to other subjects that should be, particularly politics.
Well, we need a stronger political education, in my opinion, in schools anyway. The closest I got was modern studies, and all we spoke about was like older elections that didn't have any relation to what was happening. And that was when Holyrood was just being established when I was doing that. So it was, a bit detached. By the way, in this report, have any of you seen the full report? Did they mention colonialism in it? Or the empire or any of that?
I know that the professor that wrote it is a huge proponent of empire. He loves it. So much so that some of his fellow professors at Oxford wrote a letter sort of condemning his enthusiastic support for the British Empire and colonialism.
So it seems like this report should have been looked at with a certain perspective and critical engagement about the bias that would be in this report.
Yeah. A lot of internalized bias, I presume.
Yeah. And I think, and the same applies to, it's really good to hear what you were saying about the history and stuff. I didn't take history at Stand the Grade, but it's good that they were doing that, because that could be applied to so many. Because, even if you look at, even from the Yes perspective or the pro-independence perspective, like if you look at the National, I read that with bias awareness towards the SNP in it, so it needs to be applied to everything. And I think it's skills that people need to use more often, but also be aware of and exercise a bit more, and that comes down to education, different experiences and stuff too. And that's not being patronizing towards anybody, because it's something that I learned very, very late on, by being lucky enough to go to university and study. And that's when I really sort of learned my critical reflection skills. So, it's something that we need to be getting people to grapple with really, really early on.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, those skills would be badly needed actually in our society. If you look at the amount of people on Facebook, particularly older people that aren't as familiar with technology and things like that, they believe so much of just what appears in their timeline. We know sort of, critical sort of analysis of where is this coming from? What point might somebody be trying to make? Like the example we're talking about, like the sort of moral panic that's getting whipped up about trans people at the moment, and the amount of things that people are just accepting at face value in Facebook that's really radicalising like a whole sort of generation of particularly older people.
And there was and the mainstream media as well play a role in this. As we know, there's biases in different media outlets, like you've identified. But it was one really positive thing, talking about the trans rights issue and the GRA specifically, was that LBC had Katie Montgomery on, who's a trans woman and very active for queer rights. She appeared on LBC talking about this very issue. About the GRA, and she was being very, very clear and saying, similar to what me and Deborah were saying last week, is about this is what the GRA is about. This is what is included. The argument about toilets and single sex spaces isn't even mentioned here, and this has just been whipped up. So the onus falls on these mainstream media outlets to have these voices on there, which will help people to make these decisions, particularly when it comes to bias. The BBC got criticised a couple of years ago when they were talking about the climate, for having a climate denier on there just for balance. That's not all right. Like it's not like you look at Question Time, they've always got a Labour and they've always got a Tory. You don't have to have the extreme views. We've accepted that climate is an issue and it's something that needs to be addressed. So we don't need the climate denier on there for this so-called bias. We need to approach issues with minorities, with minority voices at the centre, and not just minority voices, so trans people, but trans people of colour, trans people who are excluded for various other reasons, if they're disabled, if they are living in poverty, all these types of things. We need to have this wide spectrum of trans voices included in these situations, and I think that would help people to understand these issues a lot more, particularly around the different biases that are presented on these mainstream media outlets.
Okay, any other comments anybody wants to leave, or we move on to our favourite topic?
Tory corruption.
Tory corruption. We are currently in a debate as to whether this should have its own section in the show every week, because it feels as if every week there's another story about massive corruption among. This week, a judge ruled that Michael Gove's decision to award £560,000 contract to a market research firm whose owners he was friends with, along with being friends of Dominic Cummings. The court ruled that it was unlawful. That was a case brought by the Good Law Project, who, following up from last week, are also taking the Prime Minister to court over his decision to give a peerage to Peter Cruddas, who had been rejected by the Appointments Committee, but that was overruled by the Prime Minister, who 3 days later, the Tory party received a large cheque from Mr. Cruddas. Totally unconnected.
Definitely.
So, more Tory corruption, guys. Is there anything else I've got to say about it? I feel as if...
I'm just thinking we need a jingle. We need some sort of blistering.
Tory corruption. You know,
You'll never guess what they've done now. It was very camp of me there, sorry.
Really, I loved it.
I just think that, as you say, every week it's like, oh, what have they got up to now? Oh, they're just putting their hand in the purse, they're dipping the till, they're bricking, they're putting pound coins in their socks. I mean, are we ever going to be surprised when anything like this comes about, when they say the Tories have done this terrible thing? It's very typical, isn't it? And what will the repercussions be? Do you think Gov's going to get jail time?
That's exactly what I was going to say. The most depressing thing about it is, does anybody really think anything will come out of this? I don't even think he'll have to resign for cabinet. They'll just keep going,
and they'll keep going as if nothing's happened, and then we'll get the next Westminster voting intentions, and it'll be up 2%. This is actually where we are, and the situation with Gove. There's really good coverage on this particular story on Novara Media on their podcast from last week, and they kind of delve into some of the nuts and bolts, and they have somebody from the Good Law Project there who sets it out really quite clearly. But the biggest issue is that in the judgment for that, they said that they understood that the government was in a position because of the COVID, and they had to get these focus groups done quickly and blah, blah, blah. However, they didn't even consult any other organisations. So they basically, Gove had said to Cummins, public first, they can do this contract for the focus groups for the public information about COVID-19, and they didn't even put it out to tender for anybody else, even though that they had similar organisations already working on projects that could be aligned with it. So, for example, YouGov. So the judgment was sympathetic to an extent, because they said we understood the time pressures at the time. I wish they were really taking. I wish the UK government were taking into consideration time pressures at other times. But they were considering it at this time when they were given a contract to their pals. This argument doesn't wash with me at all, because I understand you don't want to be. Perhaps you could understand if there was a quicker bidding process or whatever. They were only looking to companies that that had been connected with similar projects in the past, but they just give it to one organisation without even allowing others to bid for it. So it's blatant, again, similar to the Cruddas story. So, but will there be any detrimental impact for the UK government? Nah. Will this impact on their voting intention polling? Nah. So, where do we go from here? And I think that it really, really comes down to, it should be the mainstream media that's holding this government to account. There was a push notification for this one, so props to BBC for doing that. But I'm talking about the real, why are they not hauling, some Gove in, or hauling, another minister in, and actually hauling them over the coals for this? Because this is really, really bad, and this is what media outlets should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, why every time Boris Johnson appears, why is he not being asked, are you going to sack Michael Gove? Every time he appears, the media should be getting asked that. They should keeping the pressure on about it, but they're just going to let it go. But and it's not because they can't do it, because my God, Corbyn couldn't look out his window without getting asked about, somebody had tweeted about somebody who may have been a member of the Labour Party tweeted something that could be construed as anti-Semitic. He was harassed about it. So the media can keep the heat on when it suits them, but when it comes to Boris and the Tories, well, they just kind of don't.
What the media can even do on this situation is say, well, do you know what, we're not going, they could put the question to the Prime Minister. If he chooses not to answer, you could say, do you know what, we're just going to black out the government until you tell us, or you at least acknowledge this question. They could say, do you know what, we're not going to do any coverage of you, which could actually go in his favour. But I'm saying, there could be some sort of boycott of the government, message it or whatever, until he answers these important questions. They've got this power at their disposal.
Deborah?
I think there would be a bit more understanding on the issue if they had been, the time constraints point that you made, Brian. I think that there would be a lot more understanding that if it was, they were hurrying up and getting everything sorted and we got it all out quick, but they didn't. It was a prolonged experience. How late were they in getting all the dominoes lined up in a row for the COVID
Pandemic.
response? Yeah, the pandemic. I just think that it's very telling of the state of the current UK government.
It's difficult to know where the corruption ends and then competence begins.
Yeah.
Was the primary motivation to funnel money to their pals, or was it because they were in a complete panic and didn't know what to do? And that pal of Dominic, he knows about this stuff. Let's ask him and get him to do it, without any sense of what a proper procurement process or procedure would look like. Either's not good in a government. Having a corrupt government's bad, and having an incompetent government's bad. But having a corrupt, incompetent government is the worst of both worlds.
And imagine giving this contract to your pal because you're like, this person really knows about focus groups and public communication, and then come up with really shit slogans that the England public health. I don't know exactly what this exact campaign was for, but I mean things like control the virus. Like if that's your mate producing that type of work, I'm sorry, but I wouldn't be giving my pal that job. I'm sorry, but I'd be like, I really liked your yellow and green sign, but maybe no for the UK government during a pandemic. We'll maybe come back to you when we're doing like reducing sugar and cola. Do you know what I mean? Like that's maybe on that level,
Just imagine the meeting saying, so this is our campaign, and just going, mate, I gave you 500 grand for this. Come on.
Control the virus.
It was
tell them to sing a happy birthday.
Mm-hmm.
It's just other countries are like closing their schools and shutting down transport and premises and maybe we should just tell them to wash their hands. Just sing happy birthday and wash your hands. We'll be fine, sorted.
And I think I'm always mindful, because it's good to laugh, and sometimes you have to laugh about these things because it's so terrible.
If you don't laugh, you're great.
Actually, yeah, I think particularly, at the backdrop of how many people have lost their lives and just how traumatic this has been for so many people.
Yeah.
But we've got a government that had a yellow and green sign saying control the virus, and this is this is the reality. And it's true that is that just giving jobs to your pals and cronyism and corruption, or is it just really bad judgment? Or is it both? It's impossible to. I'm really looking forward to reading some academic research of this in a couple of years' time, so we can really grapple with some of these issues. Because, like you said, I don't know where the corruption begins and the incompetence ends. Somebody needs to do the legwork and find out for me, because I have no idea.
Talking about memes, that sign with the green and yellow chevrons, control the virus, that became a meme in itself.
A very extensive meme with lots of different versions, like head, shoulders, knees and toes, and from that, and it was really, really well. I mean, that's the thing. You gave that job to your pal, yet people on the internet were making much, much better ones.
Exactly.
For a lot less money.
For a lot less money. And in comparison, I mean, the Scottish government, there's a lot of questionable things, and I'm really looking forward to seeing when a review starts on that and some of the decisions that were made. But I think that one thing that we cannot criticise the Scottish government for is the consistency with messaging, public health information, and actually it was more problematic because the mainstream media were actually showing the incorrect information, saying it's for the UK when it's just for England and vice versa. But, the facts thing I think is really good. I think that, the Scottish government have been really clear and having the consistent message from the First Minister most days, and the Health Secretary at the weekends. It's been really, really consistent. And I really don't think that Nicola Sturgeon would give her pal a job to create that terrible, terrible campaign.
And if she did, you can better believe there'd be calls for resignations flying about the media.
Before she's
wall-
even admitting to doing anything wrong, yeah.
It would be wall-to-wall sort of pressure.
Absolutely.
I was just looking for the memes there, and we had done one, and it says, "Get COVID, drive to Durham, kill your parents."
There we are. Just in the nice green and yellow sign there, spot on. And there's a nice tie-in to end there with the tie-in of Dominic Cummings driving to Barnard Castle to check his eyes.
And that's all this week for Tory corruption.
Corruption.
Ding, 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 ding.
We're definitely going to have to get a wee jingle for that.
I'll work on it.
I'm happy to lend my vocals, but they're terrible. And
Can
see,
we
you
get-
didn't want to give your mate that job, me singing. No.
Can we get a clip of Boris going, "Oh, what am I like?" at the
I'll
end?
find one. I'm sure I'll find one.
Okay, our final sort of thing we're talking about this week is the Radical Independence campaign had their conference this weekend. I think it was a sort of not quite a relaunch really. They've obviously been inactive for a while. They did have a conference where some elements tried to close down Rick, and that was sort of disputed with some elements that wanted to continue on. By all accounts, it was a very positive conference, looking at ways to go forward and how Rick should organise a real sort of grassroots approach, which is nice to see. Did anybody see anything or hear anything about Rick this weekend?
I saw some tweets and Facebook posts. A lot of folk were really excited and enthusiastic about it and said there was a real reinvigoration into the movement. And the thing I've always liked about Radical Independence Conference is the sort of decentralisation of all the groups. Like we've got one here in East Dunbartonshire. I know there's one in Glasgow, and the Highlands have got one. They seem to be, really dedicated groups of folk. So I hope that it gets the wee boost it needs.
I think these type of groups are really, really important when it comes to radical independence. I was going to say, obviously that goes hand in hand, but for achieving independence, because I know a lot of people are not invigorated or drawn to the SNP and or the Greens and even some of the other political parties. And I think that these sort of movements are really, really important. And what Rick done in the last independence referendum, actually going into areas which have naturally got a really, really low voter turnout, engaging these people, registering them to vote, mobilising them, all these types of things. And ultimately, I think there's going to be efforts like that in the next referendum that's going to swing it for an independence vote. So I think, everybody on the left, even though I criticised it last time, on the left, who's the left? Anyone that's progressive, anyone that wants to see Scotland as an independent country who radically changes their economic functions and how they value people and the quality of life that people have, need to really look to organisations like Rick, whether it be signing up or just being a supporter, sharing their things on social media, because when things start to hot up, which hopefully won't be a million miles away, these groups are going to be really good for engaging with groups of people who are not your typical geeks like us who like to follow parliamentary politics.
Yeah, I think it's important because it gives a sort of a place for the non-aligned left, I would say, to go and organise and to still contribute when, particularly with hopefully a referendum in the horizon. And I think if you need these other sort of perspectives to independence as well. The sort of main one, I think, is always going to be, to a certain extent, dominated by the kind of leadership of the SNP. And so something like Rick, not only does it give somewhere for the Greens and unaligned, but also some of the more radical voices in the SNP. It gives them a sort of point to rally around and create a alternative vision beyond. I think there's a tendency in some elements of the SNP to downplay the radicalism of independence and think just vote for independence because it's not really going to change anything. But that kind of then turns a lot of people off to think, well, why bother then if it's not going to change? I always remember a long time ago, like before the independence referendum, when independence was not really seen as a an immediate thing that could happen soon. And the SNP used to talk quite a lot about Coronation Street. I always remember they'd always say, like, don't worry, Coronation Street will still be in the telly. And I just always found that very sort of strange tack to try and go out the way to settle. There's one thing alleviating people's concerns that they might have about independence, but I always felt there's an element in SNP leadership that take it a bit too far and convince people that it's such a safe option, it's not even worth bothering about, to be honest.
Yeah, I think if they're going to keep Coronation Street on the telly, why don't they step it up a notch and say we'll bring Bet Lynch back, and then people might vote for it. Do you know what I mean? Like, really sell it to people. Don't just say Coronation Street's going to be there. Really get some of these good characters back, and then people will be voting for it, you know.
I think with the Radical Independence conference, it's really important that we do have the conversations that the SNP maybe don't want to, like about currency. I said that through gritted teeth there.
Yeah.
And, you know, financial institutions that we're going to have, because I think we will get really good insight from the Radical Independence groups. I think they can provide us with that radical view that we need.
That's actually a really good point, Deborah. But I think the fact that they're not a political party is a big thing, because SNP and even the Greens too, when political parties are trying to sort out their sort of manifestos and their sort of policies, they're awful aware they don't want to seem divided. They don't want to kind of cause too much sort of division within their own party by opening up these debates.
Yeah.
You know, someone like Rick doesn't have the concerns. They're not worried about the electorate thinking that they're no worth voting for because they're not standing for election. And, you know, they are a sort of, they're open about the fact that they'll not all agree in the same things. So having a big debate in a Barney about stuff to get to the best position doesn't have the same fears that it does for political parties.
Exactly.
And I think that, you know, the SNP have now said that the Growth Commission that was that brought out in 2016 or 2017, something like that, a couple of years ago anyway, which is now defunct because of Brexit and because of other things, which is good because it wasn't exactly very exciting, quite concerning in many, many ways. But it would be good to see organisations like RIC and perhaps even working with Green Yes and other to really come up with what is within the scope of actually being an actual transformational independent Scotland. Because unfortunately, and this is me being quite critical of the SNP, as I often am, that I don't think we're going to get that really enticing and new radical Scotland that I think that so many people on the left and the pro-independence group really, really want. But it would be good to see one that's, you know, it's difficult to cost these things, but something that's actually tangible, something that we can work towards and say, because, you know, a lot of people that I speak to that are quite ambivalent towards politics is very much like, you know, I don't support independence because I don't want the SNP in power. Well, actually, it's arguable that if you want the SNP not to be in power, it's to bring about independence. And or have another indirect too, whatever way it goes, because Scottish politics is, I think, is going to stay there or thereabouts until we have that vote. So it's about saying, you know, independence is not about the SNP. It's not about these leading political figures at the moment. Mm-hmm. And actually having someone like Rick and talking about these real, tangible, costed ideas, which really should be the place of Labour, in my opinion, and Greens. You know, to actually have to diversify the conversation, because I hate it in the media when it's like, yeah, well, if you look at the Growth Commission, it doesn't look very good for austerity. Well, it's like, well, that's not the only option, and we will decide. You know, when independence is happening, there's going to be the negotiations. There will then be a first election, which I believe the SNP will get re-elected again, and then they'll go through the constructing this new independent country. And then after that, it's up to the electorate and who they choose. So if we're talking about these radical ideas now and embedding them in the discussion around independence, perhaps parties like the Greens, maybe whatever the SNP becomes after independence, and or the Labour Party might be in a position to really actually deliver on some of those. And I think that that's where the RIC and similar groups could actually play in the debate.
Yeah, because we've got to discuss a lot of things that, as David said, political parties are sort of constrained by the fact that they've got to get elected. Do you know what I mean? So we should be talking about the electoral reform. What will it be like in an independent Scotland? What will the first independent Scottish Parliament look like? How will we get a fairer, proportionate representation for the citizens of Scotland? I think radical independence, the conference, Rick, we need it. It's desperately needed, and I'm glad to see it getting going again.
Yeah, at their conference, they had speakers and a number of sort of topics. Just getting the programme up, which is now decided not to load properly. Here we go. So they had talks about global trade, environmental policy, trade unionism, LGBTQ issues, nuclear weapons, anti-racism activities, Extinction Rebellion activists was speaking, and then they had different strategy sessions about the use of direct action. So all these sessions, I'm told, is recorded and should hopefully start filtering out in bits and pieces over the next few weeks. So anybody that sounds like they're interested in that, you can find that go and look at that at rick.scott. That's Rick spelled RIC. Well, thanks guys. Another good podcast. We need to finish up because Brian has to go and meet his mammy off the bus.
Literally.
If there's anything that you'd like us to talk about in Holyrude Ungagged, you can tweet us at _ungagged and put in the hashtag Holyrude Ungagged, or you can email us at ungaggedleft@gmail.com and put Holyrude Ungagged in the subject line. Well guys, have a great week. I hope your team wins this afternoon, everybody, and
Yay.
bye-bye.
Bye. Good luck,
Bye-bye.
Scotland. Bye.
Come on, Scotland.
Yes, sir. I can boogie.